Hello everyone, today we continue our series about the English tactics of the Hundred Years' War. In the first episode, we gave a look to the genesis of such tactics, so a bit of prehistory of the Hundred Years' War from the English side. We also addressed secondary but still important aspect, that is to say the so-called Herz formation that has been often, propagandated as something unique and or particularly, aside from the misinterpretation that has been made of the same, like dragon teeth file, as opposed to the actual sense of the true pronged formation that wouldn't even be predisposed with that kind of forward angle that is often depicted, but just being the normal way infantry wings on the sides of the men-at-arms battle lines normally operated. So, not for the first time, we gave a picture of the English tactics of the Hundred Years' War, trying to stress one very simple military logical fact. That is to say that the English were pretty darn good at what they did, and their formations per se were not actually the reason why that was the case. And on the contrary, when we look about the armies and tactics of formations, etc., of the Hundred Years' War, we're often looking at something much more symmetrical than tends to be depicted, simply because a deterministic, technologistic, progressistic, modernistic reason is so dumb that also the average person can sort of play the fantasy of understanding through the art of war of the era. This is, again, not a new concept on Schwerpunkt. The bottom line being that, again, the English were pretty darn good at their job for different reasons that are military but also political and social. In that particular time in history, thanks to the monarchy of Edward III, for example, but also what had already been seeded, especially by his grandfather, that we made multiple videos on. We also know that armies developed in history mostly on their own, right? That there isn't even properly a major military reform that takes place in 13th, 14th century England to arrive to the tactics of the Hundred Years' War, nor that essentially the behavior of the English in open field had even much to do with a pre-packed standard, so-called doctrinal, in anachronistic terms, formation that was essentially the game changer and that just per se won battles, right? What won battles was moral force, collective training, leadership, luck, right? And although it's difficult to remain insensitive, as we've seen, to the striking series of victories in very desperate odds that make really the English armies of Edward III, so to say, the actually strongest in history, because it's simple math, right? We do not know of any other army in history that achieved this, right? So you would think that there is some sort of more categorically definitive reason why we're so successful. Just bear in mind that there is also a lot at stake. In fact, behind all this, France developed dramatically in the previous century to eventually suffer an important crisis. The English were able to exploit this very often, themselves risking the system to, like we're talking, the mid-14th century crisis, a very delicate moment for everybody involved. Had the English lost even one of the brilliant, for them, battles, such as, I don't know, Crécy, Poitiers, Azincourt, they would have probably faced dire repercussions at home, possibly quite definitively crippling ones. So we have to be careful in general about about the narrative, really, that we pass, especially to the average informed, so to say, audience. I personally, as you know, specialize in tactics, so I have of the Middle Ages, and I have especially my dog in the fight for 13th, 14th century battles, and I'm very openly critical in my published work about, say, historiography, how the scholarship behaved essentially towards these topics. I am not an expert about the 100 Years' War per se, but on Schwerpunkt I gave an example, for example, in the video about the Battle of Poitiers, not only of how essentially a battle is to be analyzed and not simply, trying to force to cram a prepared narrative just on sources that really say something very different. And studying a battle is very complex, right? It doesn't work like, you just read a bunch of sources and you sort out what happens. You have really to spend a lot of time looking at all of them in the original language, understanding really what they're trying to say. First of all, looking at how these armies were deployed. If we know, we often don't know. There are some conflicting accounts, others that are just apparently conflicting. You must be aware of the terrain, how it was at the time, which we also often don't know with precision. So it can take months, if not even years, even for big battles with tens of sources, as a matter of fact, if you really want to be serious about the whole thing. Also studying the campaign, the intentions, like how do you pass there from strategy to battle to tactics proper. Today's video is dedicated to the longbowmen, and I decided to follow the let's say already at least as a provocation, the bias that is often ingrained in this kind of narratives of essentially trying to present arrow fire that is universally throughout all the Middle Ages and beyond, like the obviously pertaining to a light, which means non-decisive, the non-decisive arm in the game, even more important in fact than the heavy infantry, the men-at-arms, that we will deal instead in a last video. And this is just about the general thing. We will cover, as we have already done, all the battles of the 100 Years' War one by one. So it definitely doesn't stop there. We talked about specific historical military units of the period, and again, we will essentially go on that way. But it's important to make clarity first and foremost. So we will deal with the longbowmen issue from both a dialectical and probably a technical sense, because there is no doubt that, as I hinted at before, the most common narrative, just visit, for example, famous, Himaists YouTube channels and look at whenever they talk about tactics or battles in general, the kind of questions on their Facebook pages and the YouTube comments, it always gets down to something. What if you have 100 guys armed with this weapon and 100 guys armed with this other weapon? Who does win? I mean, that's the sort of vanilla level and unfortunately most commonly widespread level of allegedly adult people mindset and also behavior, frankly. I mean, because what kind of question is that, like, posed on this kind of channels that often don't even actually discuss the art of war, just very often just arms and armor, and even there in ways that sometimes are debatable because they narrow things down to the individual sort of material performance of this or that tool, so to say. So specializing in tactics, the first thing you have to really ask yourself is how not just combined armed tactics, but in this sense, how collective combat works, right? Which is not a matter of speculation or philosophy. It's not by reading Keegan, The Face of Battle, that you become an expert on that. It's simply a matter of logic and feasibility, which is admittedly a very difficult and complicated thing to do, mostly because we don't have a videotape of the Battle of Agincourt for us to know exactly how things really went. Unfortunately, the same battle accounts are very often very if not openly contradictory, at least saying quite different things. And it's also interesting how certain commentators tend to pick, I'm talking scholarly commentators in this case, also tend to always bend the narrative to picking what is more convenient for especially the notion, oh, look at how powerful the longbow actually was, except, all the other accounts do not give a damn about weapons in general, and very often, in fact, what is remarked by the sources does not really mean that we should focus on the performance of the single weapon. And don't get me wrong, also in this videos are nowhere near and actually antithetic to any kind of belittling of the performance of the English armies, but also of properly their own very weapons. I mean, the longbow was a freaking beast, right? And I'm not claiming that there is something ineffective or useless in that. On the contrary, the fact that in fact, what are at this point properly professional armies, as it's typical of the later Middle Ages for different political and social reasons, implement what was actually the bow as it was built since prehistory in Western Europe in the same identical way every freaking where, and used every freaking where in the same way, to this level of almost giantism. We know that also from the shipwreck of the Mary Rose, etc., that the same longbowmen were at this point quite athletically trained individuals that were also they were not really scoliotic in the sense that their backbone was bent, but I mean, the bow is an asymmetric weapon, anatomically speaking, so you have to have different muscles developed in, and so just the same posture of these men must have revealed their craft. They're pretty tall people, because the longbow is just, as any weapon in that sense, designed on the the user's body, and that's why it's big. It's just like the same type of bow, but just bigger than the average, because who is wielding it is essentially more powerful himself. These were all very well trained troops. As you can argue, actually, everybody involved at this point really was. It's not like, I don't know, across the English or the French armies, like the men-at-arms, the crossbowmen, the pavisiers, or whatever, were not equally trained in that impressive way. And we will try exactly to show this, like not much concentrating on the cheap, quick answer. Like, it's because of the long. Okay, but what? First of all, really, and secondly, what was actually out there together with the longbow, and how much do we actually know, not just about the longbow, which is an interesting question, even in strictly physical performance of the individual weapon, but especially, as I was just saying, about the collective use of the longbow, which is something that from the sources is much more difficult to grasp for reasons that I already explained elsewhere. Again, on my channel, I often talk about this, but we'll try to deal with again here as well. So let's start from the most banal aspect. Let's say that the fact that the longbow's range and firing rate, for example, remain topics of debate among experts with actually little consensus, right? And we'll explain now why. First of all, the general point is the following. Yes, we do have remains of longbows. We talked about just before about the Mary Rose shipwreck, and we do have different sort of depictions. We have an idea, even just comparatively to other missile weapons, which is an avenue that is often not taken, more or less how performing the longbow really is, right? And in strictly, again, range. The simple question that could simply mess everything up is also, again, do we have an actual video footage of how, I don't know, accuracy the English longbowmen used to shoot against the approach? We will not even descend into that, because as we explained already in the previous video, there is a huge debate regarding also how these wings operated, whether they had mostly just bogging down the enemy cavalry charges as they were being carried out, or was it mostly like a flanking maneuver? Just by that, which is a much more important, in strictly military terms, much more important factor and dynamic than any ranged longbow could ever have. Like, we cannot even say exactly what this archers at large really looked like in terms of the individual performance of their bows. We don't have them. We don't have them all together, right? And this is pity because we know, of course, that there were thousands of these archers shooting at a time. So even just in terms of individual evidence, like it's practically impossible to ever reconstruct the overall level of these weapons, let's say, based on the average, but also in fact on how this adapt, let's say, to a more collective dimension. Because you can have like the longbow is an incredibly and excellently crafted weapon that can achieve impressive performances, but the way you use that, right, individually has nothing to do with how you use it collectively, right? For a bunch of reasons we'll explain now. It's been argued that essentially the maximum range of the longbow, at least really a useful one, also in military terms, because those are different things, could be roughly 300 yards, right? There are almost 300 meters essentially. That's one of the few easy equivalences, between the decimal and the English one. The question there is how spent an arrow and what kind of arrow in that sense is, and why would you actually want to stretch, for example, that maximum range? How do we evaluate what's in between, which is actually the most, and where in fact they're the most militarily useful aspect of the story? Shakespeare in King Henry IV Part 2 notes that 280 290 yards were an impressive feat, right? Probably the effective range was approximately 200 yards. So it's not like you couldn't harm someone at 300 yards, or possibly even more, right? And this really depends. Just think about, I don't know, inclination, right? Gravity. We know, for example, that at least we are told, and we can't be fully sure about that at Crécy, the Genoese crossbowmen attacked the English longbowmen up a slope, and they had, of course, the worst the worst terrain in that, and not just they were defeated, but it seems also that they were numerically inferior, and that just, for example, is not also a useful example just per se of the longbow superiority, because these other factors do not display any level of parity in that context. It's not like in warfare you need to have that. On the contrary, good for the English that they managed to pull that off. But in that sense, it's something that happened in that specific context that involves mostly a strategic decision to attack, for example, an enemy that is in that defensive position and whatever, and that has not really much to do in that sense with which kind of specialists you sent to deal with the matter, which is actually, as we explained in the previous video, actually a much more symmetrical thing than usual, but evidently showing that still from the French side, they thought that something could be done about it. It's not really clear what happened there too. The notion is that the French did not know how to use the Genoese. There's the notion, for example, that the Genoese crossbow strings were ruined by humidity, which is also nonsense because all archers in the Middle Ages knew how to perfectly keep their bowstrings dry. We even have the geniuses that sorted out that the Mongols withdrew from Europe, or they stopped in any case their advance because in Hungary it rained. Yeah, exactly. That also accounts of why, for example, they took over Russia in winter, which is notoriously a very dry weather. By the way, I mean, there are people who are literally stating this stuff, which is really a mental problem. Like, this is not much a historical mistake. This is really wanting to force hand on things that are much bigger than they would ever admit they are, for the obvious reason that they don't care about history, but just about making statements that make them appear grand in front of a gullible or impressionable audience, like most people also actually are. This is just like the child stomping his foot, saying, "No, I have to always to be right, no matter reality, right? And so reality is actually also a much more complex thing to understand, and it works regardless, in fact, of whether you understand it or not. And that's the actual problem that we are always confronted with in our life. I would also say, again, that in general, it is, of course, likely that the English bows were fairly well, say, standardized by some degree in this era. So I'm not making the case that, oh my god, it was all so different and weird, etc. But consider any factor that could happen, right? The fact that this stuff was brought on campaign, that individual archers could feel sick, as you know, famously enough, even at Agincourt, that there could be all kind of impediments, moral factors, etc. So thinking that the individual performance of the bow per se stops to how the bow was made in combat is something quite complicated. By the way, we have a great deal of replicas, testing, and reenactment that really started very early in times. Actually, in times where the longbows were still in current military use, as we also saw from, for example, the Tudor warfare videos. In fact, remarkably, a 1550 experiment demonstrated an arrow piercing an inch thick seasoned timber at around 250 yards. That's why before I was noticing that even at 300 yards, you could definitely harm someone with that. Contemporary tests, of course, are more easily documentable for us, regardless of the fact that we're using replicas that are, however, fundamentally similar or comparable to the authentic bows as they were handed down to us archaeologically. And such testing indicates that essentially a 100-pound bow, meaning 100-pound draw bow, could, which is roughly 45 kilos, could launch a bodkin, that is to say an armor-piercing arrow, roughly 240 yards, while a heavier broadhead arrow about 200. Right. Now, these distances could be increased, for example, with stronger bows or lighter arrows, but at the same time, that influences, for example, the same trajectory, the same ballistics, and things start getting complicated. And this is something that definitely the English archers of the 100 Years' War would have laughed about. I mean, they had their good enough. That is usually what works in combat, in warfare, broadly meant, because these guys used these arrows, by the way, not just in the climatic pitched battles of the era that are, of course, more famous, but also in quite other different contexts. And then there is just how you can essentially adapt to the situation, how you gain experience, how you just essentially feel the weapon per se. The interesting aspect of this is that the longbow's range was notoriously inferior to the crossbows, right? So for all the people, we'll get to this now, but the longbow, it's easy because the longbow shot faster, so it shot more arrows in a given amount of time than a crossbow could do. But this is just like if you're reasoning in purely mathematical terms. So, I move a centimeter away from the maximum range of the longbow, and so the longbow would be ineffective, isn't it? So this reasoning, of course, calls for a bit more of concreteness, because even though, as I explained in the previous video, once for all, that there are scholars that openly claim that, of course, the not just the crossbow, but also the crossbowmen in general as an arm were more effective in line of principle than archers, longbowmen, or even longbowmen. Which is also something that spread. By the way, longbows were used pretty much everywhere. Like, it wasn't just like the English that further specialized in archery rather than in crossbows. For reasons that, in fact, probably had not much to do with the performance of the weapon per se, but just for what they could find and they could operate with. But it's evident that it's not just like the crossbow's range made the difference, and that actually when we talk about bodies of men that are fighting against one another, in fact in large groups, this thing of what's the best performance of the weapon probably has nothing to do with the outcome of this clash. First of all, because even if the individual weapon's performance had just per se anything to do with any decisiveness in the engagement, the other side would have immediately stopped using at that point an ineffective weapon would have adequated to the latter, and the problem would have ended, right? In warfare, we know that this is not how things work, in the sense that if you go at war already with a weapon, and again, France and England in the 15th century are the same civilization, right? They're the same material culture. They are basically the same society. They have many deeper, more intimate cultural ties in many ways. So we're looking at a condition of at least material, technological symmetry, right? It's not like going at war with a crossbow was something an idiot would do because there was a longbow from the other side. On the contrary, bows normally were used in the periphery of Europe, right? In the Celtic fringe, including, in fact, Wales, where lots of, in fact, so-called English longbowmen came from. We also explained how actually the Welsh there is no evidence at least that the Welsh were any better or worse archers than the English, that were actually paid even more than them. So that also will have meant something on the market of war. But actually, the bow seems to have been also not quite interesting for other peoples. Yes, in the 15th century, there had always been longbowmen across Europe. It seems that the success of the English did bring to some imitation. Say the same French at a point have to cope with this by creating their own archers units. They even import the Scots, that in part also had this already on their own. We know of the Burgundians, and we're talking there also of Germans, of Italians. But just to make the example here, we know that the finest longbows were actually crafted in Lombardy, right? Because there was a very good wood quality due to the local climate in the pre-alpine zone. And what did the Lombards do? Or that had, by the way, the most advanced military arms and armor production, as it put it in this way. I made videos about this in the entire era. Did they use longbows on their own? They crafted this perfect, best longbows with the best elasticity, resistance, etc. What did they do? They sold it to the English that used these bows in their wars against the French. At some point, as we've seen, against other Lombards, or northern Italians, like the same Genoese that were often used by the French as well. And political affiliations aside, in a politically fragmented era, in fact, it's pretty much evident that basically the whole Western Europe kept going on with crossbows without many issues, and that even though the English were quite successful in many circumstances, it doesn't seem that the crossbowmen were ever disregarded, and or that, even this sort of more famous ethnic units like the Genoese ones ever suffered in reputation or in, job offers because of what had happened, in episodes like the aforementioned one of Crécy, right? So if we were to depict this in mathematical terms, essentially, the bigger the system, the more difficult it is to keep it together, and essentially the more things go astray from what you want, which means that if you arm a unit with a certain amount of weapons, basically the individual performance of those weapons is going to be, as we said before, increasingly altered the bigger the unit by so many other factors that in fact do not have anything to do with just even what is essentially a static or just potential physical quality, like a weapon performance, right? There is always a preponderant human factor. There is mostly combined arms that, in fact, is the key to this. Like, it's not, in fact, the longbowmen that won the fights per se. It's that otherwise we would have used armies of missile troops, and the missile troops instead are always light, and as such they cannot stand their ground against the heavies that are the preponderant, at least the most important of the two arms, the heavier and the one that crushes, in fact, the lighter. We know pretty well also from different battle videos, etc., that battles are quite hotly contested affairs, especially the bigger ones, and that especially no source tells us fundamentally that, these guys won because this weapon made them win. All right. At most, as we'll see today, you find anecdotes saying, well, I don't know, those archers kicked those horsemen's ass, but in which context, right? Because it was not even normal for heavy cavalry to be, and even less routinely, in fact, to be, even within the 100 Years' War, to be beaten by archers. This is not to be actually even found, and the context, in fact, is much more eloquent about this. And even when they wrote something like this, first of all, again, there is actually a more than 100 years of wars that between France and England that historically wise do not provide with actual evidence of the decisiveness of the single weapons, but that actually say a big deal of stuff against the same, and that at large, in more generic terms, actually do not seem to give a damn about weapons, right? At most, and this happens also for other people, there was, say, an association of people with a certain kind of weapon. The Swiss Vosges at some point were considered as a matter of national pride. The same longbow for the English gentry at some point did become a myth, which is also the one that reverberated in modern historiography. But what happened on the battlefields is, at least to the degree that shows the preponderance of the men-at-arms and combined arm tactics with a secondary / auxiliary / subordinated role of the missile troops, is actually quite clearly documented. Robert Hardy, a celebrated longbow scholar as an accomplished actor, died several years ago, claims in his book Longbow, because he was an expert in this, he was also consulted for the Mary Rose finding, like as a specialist, that an archer could feasibly shoot 15, quote, reasonably aimed arrows per minute. This assessment is likely very correct, right? We know this. In the mid-19th century, the Prince Louis Napoleon, that was one of the first, it was a military technology enthusiast. We talked about the mitrailleuse recently, and they even replicated Roman warships, things like that, right? The 19th century had this myth of progressism and technologism, and he it was one of the earliest, in fact, reenactors, replicas, testers, remarked that an archer who fired 12 shots in a minute and missed even once was, quote, very likely esteemed, which aligns with, in fact, also further testing, right? Firing 6 individually aimed arrows per minute is certainly achievable, right? This is the rate most scholars today accept, though Hardy advocates for 10, and Fowler in The Age of Plantagenet and Valois proposes 10 to 12, right? So it's actually possible that this is the case. However, before passing to the comparison to the crossbow, there is one thing to consider. This is something you can achieve individually, all right? And individually, we know that, say, the smaller, let's put it in this way, the engagement is, right, down to the individual Rambo guy, outcomes can be, and performances can, of course, be more random, especially the outcome of combat can be more random, and in fact the individual performance more striking, right? When you fight in masses, in collective formations, there is an overarching logic that encompasses what you're trained for, especially. That is to say, no doubt, by the way, that an average longbowman could really perform impressive stunts with these weapons. I mean, I remember years ago there was a Facebook a video that circulated of one of those guys who make testing replicas, etc., and that could shoot, I don't know, a bunch of arrows in a few seconds and hit all the targets, right? That's something you do in a circus, all right? The fact that you can do it, it's no surprise, really, for nobody. It can be done. We very well know that, and in the Middle Ages, they very well knew that, even likely better than us. But when you're in combat, you're doing something completely different. You have to maximize the effect of the advantage that the collective dimension offers you, right? And when we talk about missile fire, especially in this age of technological development, the fundamental point was delivering neatly spaced and concentrated volleys. Right, this was the case for at large at some point, even musketry fire later on, but definitely also for archery before. Different things could happen. We're talking about the larger engagements. So ideally, the point is this, that you can have all these archers shooting however they would have liked. And in some moments, in fact, of battle, this would have really occurred because it was a total mess and you couldn't quite... It's simply a system that decays because of entropy, right? This is exactly the same reason why, for example, and I made multiple videos on this, 18th century musketry fire training, in theory, was based on volleys, but at the end of the day, after the first ones, it all turned in an incredible mess. Of what actually mattered the most in combat was whether the units were trained to basically keep on shooting the fastest without even seeing what they were shooting at. And just in this zone fire level of accuracy, if so we can call, that, by the way, also indicated that in combat, as opposed to sort of simulation training, of course, precision, accuracy even drastically dropped, right? In that context, it's also different because there was gunpowder smoke everywhere, so you literally can't see, even if not only directionally, what you are shooting at. In these times of late medieval warfare is slightly different, but the concept remains. I mean, the best damage you can make to an enemy, even if you shoot, say you have a parity of time, like a timeline, there's the same duration and the same amount of projectiles shot, the best way that is actually going to cause more damage to the enemy, even at parity of hits, so at parity of physical damage, but actually instead maximally amplifying the psychological damage that is the most important one, and the disorder of the formation, the enemy formation at large, is shooting all these projectiles at once. So ideally, right, in an ideal condition, which naturally is very difficult to meet on the battlefield, at least as many volleys as possible since the beginning, before the system begins to fall apart, is to launch these waves of arrows at a time, because that single volley will essentially shatter more the unity of the enemy formation in order to essentially soften it up. And we know very well that this did not actually stop the enemy attacks, given that also the English were, as you know, mostly defending at least in the major battles of the 100 Years' War. There is the famous episode of the French cavalry wings at Agincourt that gets stopped by longbowmen, but it turns out that those weren't really quite only longbowmen, in the sense that they also had weapons to engage in melee, so they could become heavies. We're told that actually the French cavalry wings were radically and abnormally under strength. So even there, just like the Genoese at Crécy before, is that a comparison, really? of course, what all battles conventionally work like, as we explained in the previous episode, were based on, again, heavy infantry or cavalry battle lines of, again, men-at-arms and other heavies, with this subsidiary auxiliary forces on the wings. In this case, also, we tend often to say just archers. Sometimes there were actually also heavy infantrymen. It's true that there is a tendency in these centuries, especially with the crisis of the commoners during the Black Death, etc., that heavy infantry declines, that missile troops gain more importance. But it's also relative, because it's not like there were just archers, say, and men-at-arms. There was still, of course, some in between that was also made up by guys who could stand their ground and that weren't archers. In fact, that were often put to rout, but could come back because they didn't need to be aligned for combat, unlike, if not roughly, they had a loose formation, like the heavies, right? We'll see it better in the video about the men-at-arms. So this already tells you that in many ways, the general, while these arrow volleys could disorder, for example, could bog down, could annoy, could diminish essentially the effectiveness of the enemy formations. We do not have a scenario whereby, I don't know, the French men-at-arms on foot or on horseback advance, and there is just a barrage of arrows that stops them. All right, this does not happen. The technology of the time, in all the millennia which these weapons were used, could not achieve that. All right, there is not an instance in which this ever happened, in which was feasible, in which anybody thought that was the purpose. Also because otherwise this would have not been a combined armed tactics. There would have not been heavy or light infantry as we know them pretty uniformly in Western European warfare, that especially at this point was incredibly homogeneous. Essentially all countries fought pretty much in the same ways. Now, speaking of the crossbow, we know that it was limited in by its lengthy reloading process, right? It could only manage 1 or 2 shots per minute, apparently. Telling the truth, there was a pretty wide range of crossbow types. Also, in this case, we can say that likely there was an open field average to some extent that probably did arrive to did achieve that rate of fire. This aligns, for example, with the Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani's estimate. As you know, this Italian source is one of the most important, together with Froissart, etc., about, in case of Villani, especially the first part, Crécy, right, because he died during the Black Death. And who, based on a longbow rate of 6 arrows per minute, which could definitely go down to that, consider that if especially volleys were privileged, as they should have been, the point would have not been to shoot all those, I don't know, up to 15 per minute, right? The longbowman could have done that, but he could have not had the chance of timing his collective shooting with the one of the enemy, right, to be collectively effective, right? So it was better, paradoxically, to shoot less in certain circumstances than achieving not much of a damage. And Villani suggests that longbows could fire 3 arrows for every crossbow bolt, right? So again, if we make the maths more or less, crossbow 2 shots per minute, longbow 6. This, again, it's just a chronicler saying that it's not like we have in here the actual battlefield performance in every situation or whatever, but it does add up, right? As I said before, is this a draw, right? I mean, the longbow shoots more, right? But we also see here it has less range, which it also doesn't, having, say, range is not necessarily how energy gets spent in between. Again, it can vary, but if the notion is the longbow is better because it shoots faster, then the crossbow can shoot from a longer distance that the longbow cannot achieve, and so who does win? Obviously, they actually reach closer ranges for which they could target each other, and achieve different results. Also considering that, yes, again, the longbow, it shoots faster, but in this sense, if it comes at range with a crossbow, and a crossbowman can shoot, can really hurt you more, because just the crossbow is a more powerful weapon. And remember, it's not ever even just about the physical damage, it's the psychophysical damage, and the psychic part gets everything dramatically amplified, all right? Besides, and this is actually the point of it all that I would like to stress, and we know it just by also replica testing, etc., is that, and just by the nature arms and armor developed in this time in history, as long as there was armor, this was effective to parry blows. Right? It may seem a banal statement, but this is basically it. For example, aside from the fact that I will not digress on the type of quality that, for example, armor can have, right? Because replicas are often carried out with sort of best case sort of quality scenarios of this weapon. So saying like the best of this against the best of that. As I was saying before, we don't really know what battlefields looked like. It's likely, for example, that armor was not just, of course, we know that there were softer types of armor than just the metal one, etc. But even just the metal one could be likely. Just as it was the case for the quality of, I don't know, swords, etc. We look at certain masterpieces that even with today's engineering, we can't replicate in an ergonomic sense of beautiful swords, etc. But for one of those, there would have been other 9 swords that were, right? Considered during the 100 Years' War, in this case, a longbowman could, for example, afford a sword in a fairly easy manner, considering his salary. As a side weapon, and again also for engaging to hand combat, transforming themselves in some kind of heavies, at least depending on which kind of enemies they were confronting, because as you understand, that's relative. But for example, swords themselves, we noticed quite simply that until plate armor came around, swords basically increased their cutting rate, power, right? They were made in a fashion so that the blade could be ever sharper in cutting. And many people will tell you, but swords did not cut through armor, so what's the deal? Well, as soon as plate armor comes around, swords start taking sort of a different path direction. They're mostly like also more the bigger, more power loaded thing to mostly shatter the broader structure of different pieces of armor and trying to force in the joint parts rather than only cutting as before. They could devastatingly cut, and at least inflict massive damage even to plate armor with cuts. But the point being that likely, of course, there were not just armored targets, but the sense is that these arms and armor were basically designed in function of one another, right? And you can easily see this happening down the line of quality, for example, so that more or less a sword was ideally designed to destroy armor, except it would destroy itself in the process, all right? And we know essentially that arrows had normally quite a tough time against armor itself. So that in general, armor was actually effective, right? And differently from, a double-handed axe or sword blow at close range, that of course can arrive at different angles in the heat of combat, not always, and actually very often not, in fact, in the best way. Of course, projectiles flying across the battlefield are more likely to be spent to arrive at the wrong angle, and so not, of course, to be shot for the sake of precision, right? It's said that at least a close range, this of course was in fact possible also for, and really normal for longbowmen to operate like, so that also the type of arrowheads were changing for that purpose. Arrowheads could pierce armor, but at large they didn't, right? This does not mean that this hail of arrows was useless. First of all, as we will learn later, horses were notoriously not well armored, which still, however, because it would have been extremely costly, and there was full horse barding at this time. We were talking about even at the peak of armoredness on Western battlefields during this period, 1 to over 10 horses like that, which was already incredibly expensive. But we know this, but this shows that still, in fact, the art of war at the time did not care, because normally cavalry charges would arrive to the enemy lines. Remember that cavalry throughout all this period remains the upper arm. All right, during the time of the 100 Years' War in Europe, it's not like infantry surpasses cavalry in a general sense in the West, right? Actually, this thing mostly happens with the English, because the age of infantry victories in Europe by the mid 14th century is over. It lasted like 50 years, and only just in certain minority parts of the continent. Then there is even a refeudalization of warfare. I mean, actually, during the end of the 100 Years' War, there is ever more cavalry involved. So the notion that also here infantry had something intrinsically special per se is, first of all, not knowing that the English were intelligently dismounted just because they were often numerically inferior, and so they would more conveniently invest in the defensive. But of course, their men at arms especially were, of course, trained as horsemen, right? And in this sense, like any other European men at arms, right? So that they would and could also the other men at arms all over the world did dismount on some occasions, but still their primary deal was cavalry combat. So yes, there are instances in which, for example, also because of terrain, not just because of the hail of arrows, like men at arms would dismount by default, or at least at the beginning of the battle, just because they knew that was the more convenient thing. We've seen it at Poitiers, for example, from the French side, which is pretty early on. And actually, it turns out that, again, it's later on in the war that cavalry, after all those sort of infantry victories that, however, mostly still, again, knightly victories in the English case, differently from other infantry winners across Europe, that in any case in this period are no more, are basically going back to cavalry rather than infantry. And so proving that even that infantry factor alone wasn't the reason of these victories, and therefore it sort of simply dismantles the notion that there is even a fixed English tactic involved here. You can shatter the enemy with these hails of arrows because they stun you. I mean, if you make the maths of how many arrows could arrive at you, of course you would exhaust them quickly. Consider that the rate of fire, as we will see now, can be again higher, but it's not like arrows are infinite either. So you would actually want to concentrate it, just like you would do with volleys at large. The volleys that you want to shoot during the battle are better to be concentrated, all right? But in this sense, it's mostly like a stunning process. You can wound horses, which definitely bogs down cavalry in the sense that it doesn't stop the charge, but it disorders it, and the cavalry order is vital for a successful charge. It stuns the enemy. Like being bombarded with these arrows is actually very annoying, and it can perturb you mentally. Without mentioning that some lucky shot could actually kill someone, even in the best armor, and that splinters are kind of crazy with all that bombardment for hundreds of arrows coming at you. Like everything can go wrong in theory. So, and it will happen in minimal, but still sometimes deadly practice. All right. So this is actually a very important part of the story. It still does not render, of course, archery from both sides, right? Longbowmen or crossbowmen, the game changer. All right. Froissart, the greatest, again, medieval French chronicler, was actually Flemish. made a video about him, simply observes that, quote, archers are much more rapid in shooting than crossbowmen. And this is also kind of obvious, right? It doesn't require further explanation. We're told by this source, but again, what have we actually gained, right? We're just sure that that is the case because, of course, it's important to hear what they thought of this matter at the time, but it's not like it would be the only thing we should mind. More than the obvious, I would say. Now, at such firing rates, a longbowman ammo would, again, deplete very swiftly. He typically carried 1 or 2 sheaves, that is to say something from 24 to 48 arrows into battle, which is, by the way, not a lot, right, overall. Like if you look at, for example, the Eastern tradition that brought hundreds of arrows, there were also, in fact, overall less performing individuals. Like you realize that, of course, English, that's why comparative history in the art of war is crucial. Like even the English longbowmen weren't cheap shooters, right? They belonged to a Western art of war which was directed to beat pretty hard, in a sense, and in the merit of the individual shots. So actually, the longbow is a weapon designed to stun, right? It's a power designed weapon. It's not just merely a tickler, right? But this still, again, does not change the fact that it's still missile combat, and that as such it is subordinated to the actual heavies, right? So it's possible that there were 100 arrows per archers likely available, including those from the baggage train, which were surely distributed beforehand, but in this sense it means also that spent that you have to replenish in some other way, logistically. And of course, like considering the bigger climatic battles, that's where you wanted to give your most, and they would. That's where you would say see actually the greatest concentration of arrows, right? So if we consider, for example, the aforementioned Hardy's work, a rate of 10 arrows per minute, as it gives us, would actually spend 100 arrows literally in 10 minutes. If we, again, imagine that this would be, again, the actual rate of fire, which we're not 100% sure, actually not even, 80% sure, and that is it's something, in fact, you wanted to save for very specific moments and reasons. It's difficult to identify these minutes in 10 minutes, say, or even half hour in an entire day of combat, right? When at Crécy, we're told that the French kept charging for the whole day till night. When were actually these arrows shot? Because if we assume that the entire thing that the English were doing was combined arms between men-at-arms and longbowmen, the question is, yes, combat normally took place in a very confined time. Really, prolonged combat of more than a few minutes was not really a thing. And so you can imagine that actually this type of fire would be concentrated in that moment. At the same time, it's also not something you can easily or immediately predict or simply manage. Sustained volleys were, for this reason, likely seldom required. I mean, we can imagine that the actual fire concentration was something very cadenced, ad hoc, especially during charges. I actually have evidence for contemporary warfare of some crossbowmen, as it was habitual, and also how the English longbowmen did, if they could, when closing effect of an unprotected enemy flank, to actually shoot at close range from the side with these weapons. It would have actually created an enormous devastation, right? Because eventually also armor was designed to, as we've seen, absorb more random types of shot than close range ones, and especially the horses as we've seen, had very scarce protection, and at close range it was very easy to target their bellies and so on. And it's not like in the battle descriptions we're exactly told when or how this happened. You find this stuff scattered. We know that horses took a lot of hits, and we see this actually everywhere in the West, right? Even in those countries where only crossbows were virtually used. We are told at the end of the battles, especially in this post-Black Death crisis, when the Ancien regime is fully affirmed and there are just mostly like very professional troops, very heavily armored guys that, I don't know, normally it says, these men-at-arms were captured and there was such a high amount of death among horses, right? This is literally what you hear if you're familiar, if you've studied many battles from the sources. Just they keep repeating this around this time, and also in others, which I think is pretty eloquent. And it also shows how few, and this is explicitly connected with crossbow fire, right? Not always, but often enough for us to understand that that is the case. Also because we know from iconography that horses were less armored, etc. And this makes us also realize that evidently armor was very well crafted to resist crossbow shots, so even more longbow ones. Perhaps for the first time in the history of Schwerpunkt, I had to make a video in two distinct recording phases, as yesterday evening there was a blackout across the world block for some reason. This morning the light was back in. It may have happened some other time as well, but not in this simple, okay, let's restart from where we had been interrupted. Fortunately, I had temporarily paused, because you do not know, but all the very high technical effort behind Schwerpunkt sort of editing and broader magic like involved in it. In any case, we were discussing the longbow rate of fire, and so the potential benefits that really derive from this, which I'm sure, by the way, would have been there. I mean, if we were to read this, this is also a bit of a bottom line regarding the whole topic. If we have to assume that the longbow could offer advantages, surely the ones that are conventionally profiled historiographically are likely going to be those, right? What we're criticizing here is how actually relevant in the multifactoriality, so it's a terrible word, but nevertheless, of the system battle, so to say, they would have really played. Besides, there are, as I was saying before, certain weapons that are more or less suited to effect different types of circumstances, and at times in battle you go, of course, with what is the best, but may have also like a better use in some other circumstances, or vice versa. These are all things, again, that we can't mathematically measure, so we can't simply say, well, okay, then we can't simply calculate how effective this weapon was just per se in the system. It was effective. My take as a whole is that basically there actually wasn't much of a difference between, say, a unit of longbowmen and crossbowmen, especially the larger these tended to be, right? There could and would be differences. Probably they were important. I'm not even denying, as it's notorious, that during the 100 Years' War, crossbowmen had a tough time against longbowmen, as the examples that we provided before show. This may have occurred also for other factors that were not inherent the actual type of troops, but say, again, command, terrain, morale, simple numbers. Because we do get down to that. For example, if you look at the crossbowmen in general, you realize that especially the mercenary ones, like the Genoese in the French armies, were often small in number by default, right? You don't have, for example, the larger ratio of longbowmen, for example, that you find, for example, in the English indenture, right? That is, as we explained also in the last video, something a bit tricky sometimes, because you see literally, I don't know, a few tens of men-at-arms and literally hundreds or even thousands of longbowmen. As I was saying before also in this video, there would have been actually other troops, say the Gascons, that, as you know, constituted an important part of the eventually what would become the English, in fact, the Anglo-Gascon armies in operating in France. So that when you look at the English indenture, it's just like these English lords that contracted these troops, or themselves, by the way, to an extent, depending on the hierarchy we were talking about here, and that were sure that they, for example, needed this very British type of force, like well-trained professional longbowmen, but that they could and would integrate that, aside from themselves, with the men-at-arms, but also with other types of infantrymen. In general, however, it does seem that it really took more longbowmen for the English to be effective than crossbowmen for the French not to be, so that you can say, oh, well, had they had maybe more crossbowmen. Yes, but we understand that the same technicality of the crossbow works differently, and so that if you have actually, for example, an elite contingent of, for example, of Genoese crossbowmen, because there are instances in which, aside from the Franco-Scottish archers or the French crossbowmen, etc., like of course, the English bit pretty badly also this other troops. It doesn't happen all the time, and again, you have to study really battle by battle, and especially source by source, to really assess what happened. Because very often we don't even know what happened. Like, it's not like you have a battle of the 100 Years' War, and you actually know what happened on the wings. Right? It's not normal. Like, when you reconstruct medieval battles, like from one battle, you know better one side of the story. More or less, they do gravitate, as I was saying before, toward the battle lines alternation at Similia. But you may not have even that kind of very well laid out, so that you don't technically even know what happened sometimes in the battle. Sometimes you don't even know how many battle lines actually were there, what they did. We've seen it, for example, at the Battle of Poitiers. It is very well documented, but we know that there was... We're not even sure how many French battle lines, for example, took the field. And even for the English one, like, yes, there are sources that say that number or another, but let's say we mostly reconstruct this indirectly, because we know that likely there was this, we know how many they were, where they could have been deployed. It's, again, a very complicated thing to do. Things tend to add up, because in spite of all these differences, what you get from narrative sources at the end of the day is the most accurate and reliable picture that you can find about these battles. Point, right? We literally have nothing else, and in general, these narrative sources do make sense as a whole, especially when they are concluded within themselves. But to make the long story short, I do believe that there was fundamentally an equivalence in potential and also in basic practice if we were to level, again, even the different numbers that are routinely there to prevent, to see a 1 versus 1, that, again, in warfare, in fact, does not exist. And that owes there to organizational issues that are, at the end of the day, not just strategic, but political, social. That probably was an equivalence between everybody involved, like the English and the French men-at-arms, the English longbowmen and the French crossbowmen, or whoever was there, better or worse troops. So that's, in my opinion, what we're really looking at. There is another interesting source, that is the monk of Malmesbury, noting that, quote, after the third or fourth, or at most the sixth draw of the bows, men knew which side would win. This is interesting because it basically confirms what we were hypothesizing before regarding the fact that there wasn't probably even just an enormous volleys exchange, that these volleys were counted and were considered properly as such, as separated, and you could even say basically from the beginning of this shooting that, as we've seen, wasn't even to be probably that prolonged due to the numbers of the arrows that would have been quickly spent in some more sustained fire, that, again, there would have been more or less this sense of you managed to shatter that line or the other. Here, of course, the source is perhaps exaggerating, as we said before, possibly referring to, for example, the not just, for example, like how they would operate against, because we don't even know how it technically occurred in this regard against that entire battle line, all right? the notion that, for example, 3 to 6 volleys suffice to halt a charge is wishful thinking, right? There were, as we explained in the previous video, first of all, the wings to take out, so that it's not like the English went to battle knowing that the enemy did not have wings, right? As we'll see later, that the French even sort of invested in stiffening their wings, showing that likely, in fact, the English longbowmen were quite effective in that regard. As soldiers, we cannot even say properly as longbowmen, right? So I can't stress this enough. But the notion, again, that simply a charge would be bogged down and that, as such, the battle line itself would simply fail for that is not really supported by any source that makes any point regarding also the effect of the volleys on, for example, a battle line, which, again, are not to be understood as how this armies normally operated. Because, again, the English were not carrying out a revolutionary tactic. Missile troops on the wings, men-at-arms, even on foot in the center, were a thing in medieval European warfare. They would keep being. As we were saying before, actually, during the 100 Years' War, the model shifts away from that. And for reasons that, in fact, would be very interesting to connect, as we said also in the previous video, regarding the Scottish Wars of Independence roots of the English, so to say, Edward III or 100 Years' War battles that pertain to another time in the history of the art of war, in that sometimes the disclosure in text instead present as, well, basically the English went on fighting the same way, and they don't consider how, even, for example, the size of armies changed, and so how, for example, in certain circumstances, it's even easier to pull off some feats, right, if you are especially particularly qualitative compared to the enemy. Again, there are lots of issues that are often not considered when we're talking that, but longbowmen halting a charge, that's not a thing. They could disorder it, they could surely sting, they could inflict important losses, but the notion that light troops were able to hold the lines of the heavies and skip basically the fight between these and the same English dismounted men-at-arms is not evidenced by any kind of source. Again, weakening an enemy battle line by shooting over it is a thing. Even more if there was a possibility of outflanking the same battle line. But at that point, the battle line would have already come to grips with your own battle line, and so this loose formation, mostly longbowmen wings, could have, as all medieval armies did at that point, close with, at least not literally all of them, but the most advanced, the ones like a kingdom like England's could feel, like a kingdom like France could feel, the bigger ones would normally do. And again, because normally the enemy wings had been defeated for a reason or another. Besides, of course, the fact that everything got so messy in the process, and we know very well that the sources do not actually care too much even about these missile troops, other than the usual citations that are condensed in disclosure in books to show, yo, look at how actually powerful these guys were. But if you, again, took the entire historiography and measured, especially in relative terms to the single battles, how often the prowess of the archer, their relevance, right? Because nobody doubts that the longbowmen were pretty darn good in, like, just by that level, the historical time in English professional military. They do not actually talk about them at all, right? They do not even reference to them, because guess what? This is completely normal. Like in all military historiography in the era, normally battles descriptions revolve around commanders, main battle lines, and that's it, right? Errors, matters of moral force. The chronicles are extremely open about this. They're extremely vocal about what actually are the most important factors taking place during combat. This sort of technicistic mechanism of how, simply all the time the English managed to essentially enact a special tactic that everybody fell into just because, is actually not showed by the sources, right? That tend, if anything, to show that the English were tougher for some broader reason, right? And that, of course, one that resided just by quantity distribution in the men-at-arms, right? And of course, in the combined arms without the longbow, and this could have not been done. Also, this is absolutely obvious, but this is, again, the story of the tip of the iceberg. Let's assume that the longbowmen made a 10% or even a 20% of the battle outcome, right? Which is generous. If, of course, the odds are very balanced and everything swings between 49 and 51% during the battle, of course, 10 and 20% make a big difference, but they rest. They're not 50%. They rest on a much broader basis. They rest on another 40% or 30% that was made by someone else or something else, right? And actually 10, 20% is too much as a broader battlefield factors that can intervene. There are also the enemy mistakes, for example, which is another way to read this, especially on the backdrop of the French issues in their army's organization from at the beginning, the first half of the 14th century. We're told that arrows could be retrieved between assaults. For example, at Poitiers, as we've seen, where Baker reports that after defeating the first two French divisions, archers, quote, hastened to pull their arrows out of wretches who were still half alive. This is pretty crude, but this is exactly accurate. And it especially proves what we were saying before, not just that arrows were actually precious. There's that scene in Braveheart in which, there is Edward, of course, it's, very mundane sort of reference, but it sort of it's sort of accurate. There are some, it's not a very historically accurate movie, but there are some lines that are actually very precise regarding the technicality of medieval battles that are pretty much underrated in the broader movie appreciation. I don't remember which battle it was in. Instead of then shooting more with the English archers, say sent out the Irish because they're cheaper than arrows, which is also very accurate, by the way. We're told that actually Welsh archers in English service at some point created some devastating gap in the Irish ranks. Then in the movie, The Irish Defect, so that's also pretty weird. In fact, that's not how it would have even happened on a battlefield had they even wanted to obtain that. But arrows are not infinite. Arrows do cost, actually. And as we've seen in the Battle of Poitiers, this is in between, like the broader, the main engagements. There are other two lines, including the royal one that is the last. And this shows how, in that dire strait in which the Anglo-Gascon army had been boxed, strategically speaking, the English archers, there were also crossbowmen, by the way, and not, again, let's not think that this is just literally men-at-arms, some heavy infantrymen, and just archers or longbow. This is not really even the whole picture. Sometimes we don't even know, for example, precisely, so we can't even simply attribute that feat to the longbowmen alone, right? But they hastened to, in fact, they were quite desperate, right? They were saying, we have exhausted arrows and we need to retrieve them if they're still expandable from the very agonizing targets that we have put down ourselves, right? So there is no doubt that when the French persistently launched their attacks in the main battles of the 100 Years' War, they literally would get into a pretty chaotic and bloody mess, especially if you were on the wings and you were not a heavy fighter, so that you wouldn't have enough protection against these puncturing, let's put it in this way. The notion that the same French would initially, like at Crécy, go basically on horseback and then deciding to dismount later on as a more regular style, let's say, but still sided by cavalry every once in a while. may not have had actually to do per se just with English archery, in open field. We discussed this a bit in the previous video, in which we observed that European armies especially in the first decades after the Black Death, had a brutal shrinking in size. They tended also to become heavier in qualitative terms, more professional. Terrain, as we've seen also at Poitiers, for example, could be quite broken, etc. So it's not like cavalry as it's often perceived, at least depicted. I've heard many YouTubers saying this, they were just noblemen that did not accept that commoners were sort of facing them in open field. Well, this had always happened. I don't want to stress that, but the noblemen were actually the single most aware fighters, men of war, in fact, regarding the potential of infantry troops. Right. In other words, the knights knew much better how effective infantry could be than infantry. Right. That was historically relegated in a condition of psychological inferiority, even after, in general, the infantry-only victories of the first half of the 14th century that here have actually stopped. And again, the English being the only exception, but in fact not as peasants or commoners, but as actual fully fledged monarchic armies, as a matter of fact, with a nobiliar component, and also, yes, the commoners that had always existed and existed also from the French side. The French were essentially one of the, possibly even aside from the English here, that evidently got the upper hand, the most competent military in Europe. All right. Yes, they were at least, again, as the same level, English, French, Italians, etc. They were pretty much like along the same line. That's why English victories are also so striking and incredible, because we're looking at very similar military systems to begin with at the end of the day. In any case, the French may have simply adapted to the circumstances, because when a horseman really knows where and how he can operate on the battlefield. If he sees a broken terrain, if he sees very well entrenched enemy position, he will not simply launch himself into that. Like the first thing these guys were trained for was assessing the military feasibility of a particular action, and the general sense, if you study these battles, also other important clamorous French defeats like the one of Courtrai that, again, we documented, actually highlight that the French were not far away from victory. Not just they had, and that's the point, they had favorable odds and were soundly defeated. And so there is something in between, in the sense the English army, right, that achieves that. But that overall, their tactics, their strategies, their broader insight of the situation was fundamentally correct. I mean, there wasn't much of a, especially at a strictly tactical, operational, decisional level, this enormous, wrongdoing for which, they really didn't know what they got into, or they did that just out of a stupid reason. They were actually quite competent, and their tactics made a lot of sense. We'll see this better in different other battle videos, especially, but again, Poitiers, that I always name, because I also made the Battle of Formigny, for example. That is a French victory, but that's also a bit at the end of the war, and it's not so strictly representative of these specific English tactics as we more stereotypically identify them, saying between, in fact, 1346, 1415. They actually did good. I mean, the English in the last attack were just, it's like we are barely standing our ground, and they really take the timing of the flank attack to succeed, because otherwise they would have been likely overwhelmed. And so both sides had fought pretty well throughout all the battle lines and encounters. It was just an understandable military situation. There was literally, for the French, no other way to force things through. Maybe a flank attack, which is the other vexata question, that is, how many flank attacks were not documented uh, while having been projected or planned, or this normally happened, like in this case, because the defender knew better the terrain, had more control on the various elements of the army. Battlefields extended for kilometers at a time. But something I noticed and I also discussed in conferences is the fact that basically all the time we know of a flank attack having been at least prepared or enacted, it's because it eventually succeeded. So the question is, did all the flank attacks that were with a concealed reserve carried out successful? And so basically who didn't employ that just decided not to and wouldn't even think about it, which was also something particularly frequent, especially in this period. Evidently, we know a bit less than we think, especially on the very nature of these battlefields. There are actually some of the most mysterious elements of the war, probably the most, because otherwise we know fairly well about the line's deployment. We can sort of more or less know just by looking at the battlefield where the best, and it's a really enlightening experience to visit battlefields, because until you can study them for years, but until you see them, you can't really understand how a certain corner is the perfect one for deploying troops or even concealed reserves, etc. Right? But sometimes this is exactly the point. How many scouts? How many concealed troops? How many observers existed where? Right? What was happening in the surrounding of an army, of a battlefield during the same battle? That's one of the or possibly even the single most mysterious aspect of these great engagements, right? Now, let's explore some further evidence about the longbowman performance, especially against cavalry and or other specific opponents. For example, at Crécy, the French cavalry is said to have charged the English line 15 or 16 times amidst a barrage of arrows, quote, flying in the air as thick as snow with a terrible noise much like a tempestuous wind preceding a tempest. They did leave no unarmored part of a man or horse unstriken. Now, this statement is beautiful because it shows what we were saying before. First of all, 15 or 16 charges really does not mean that the charges were halted by the archers. There would be a barrage of arrows, as we've seen, that would be concentrated in the form of volleys exactly in that crucial time to try to disorder the same cavalry charge. But as thick as they were, as the source says, like a tempestuous wind preceding a tempest, they basically hit any part of the cavalrymen and the horse, and therefore wounding every or hitting at least every part that was not armored, right? Which tells you how actually intense this fire really was. And again, if we could make the maths of how many longbowmen at Crécy existed, and again, mostly we will talk about this in the video about the Battle of Crécy. But it also tells us something pretty obvious that actually we find, and I personally found in many other battles of the era that nobody studies and that are actually also bigger and or more relevant. That is to say, remember the thing we said about horses being unarmored and being taken out by crossbow bolts? This happened all the time, right? It's explicitly said all the time. It's so, I mean, not literally, but all the time in the sense that this is not something unique to, say, the Battle of Crécy or the longbowman fire. That the horses took hits because they were unarmored, all right? And there were charges and charges, and then during these charges, the horses got hit and killed or wounded. This is absolutely normal because guess what? During cavalry charges, during the fight of the men-at-arms, mounted or dismounted, the wings shot, right? That's what they did in every European army. So the question is this specifically just, Crécy was like an extraordinary English victory, and so it's obvious that sources would stress not necessarily even from an English side, but in general, the fact that these longbowmen were cool, they had contributed to the victory, etc. But how genuinely different in the essence of the art of war of the era this is, right? What is different from other battles here in as much as there was a barrage of arrows hitting basically everything of those that advanced. I found interesting evidence, for example, explicit evidence of crossbow barrages halting or at least preventing cavalry charges from happening. This also in that case, in my opinion, because there was a line of men-at-arms. I'm not saying which battle this is. I've been publishing this my own, and I will, if anything, make a video about that battle that I will mask so you as just a random one, so that you will not see who I am yet, but at some point you will. But I mean, you see, for Crécy, a statement like this is celebrated, it circulates, and whatever. For the same statement, it actually a massive battle of something like 20,000 versus 30,000 in the same 40s of the 14th century that also decided a big deal in a certain other region of Europe, and that does not even appear on disclosure in books or whatever, and that tells you how, in fact, distant the general scholarship has been towards a more comprehensively European, even just Western European art of war perspective. Well, don't you think there is something slightly wrong, that at least there is a very intense bias? I can't say in favor of the English, because again, this is something you must document, right? You can't study the Battle of Crécy without stressing how important the longbowmen were. That's something I would never do. But how, if anything, the reverse, that is to say, how scarcely has this been observed for other European armies that were doing pretty much the same, and in that case, even with crossbows, right? Quite important, because here we're not told that a cavalry charge was actually bogged down, or that cavalry didn't even charge because there was so much like a thick hail of arrows. On the contrary, here notoriously the French charge and charge and charge again, which is, by the way, 15, 16 charges is a lot. So I'm not. It actually expresses the frustration of the French against the defensive English position at Crécy. But at the same time, charges did happen. We don't know here. For example, there were many battle lines at Crécy. So if you actually make the maths and divide the charges for the various battle lines, well, it kind of fits overall the normal number of charges that every battle line would routinely carry out, because you know that how cavalry warfare works. And during the Middle Ages, this is very well documented. We've seen it at Bouvines and in all the other videos that we make about medieval cavalry warfare. You clash, you fight in melee after the charge. If the enemy has not broken for a few minutes, then you pull out. Somebody is lost in the process, but you basically realign at some distance as much as you can, and you recharge to try to smash the enemy once again. This is how it normally happens, all right? So this is also cavalry versus cavalry, but like in this case, cavalry versus infantry, the latter naturally in defense. But so, yes, at Crécy, the French line was pretty bottled. It was pretty much, the French array, it was pretty bottled, was pretty much in depth. There were many lines. But so it's obvious in the sense that such tactics would be enacted, right? The longbows shot at that point when the enemy came close at range. It was the heavy infantry that took them anyway. So again, without this combined armed tactics, it could have not worked. But let's say if you had switched, the positions, the roles, the French would have done pretty much the same, say with their crossbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms, had they again found themselves in the opposite respective straits. There is this sense that, as we've seen, horses were particularly vulnerable to intense volleys in particular. And so it's been hypothesized that these hails of arrows would wreak havoc on unarmored horses in particular. That, let's stress, were the majority also among the heavies. Montl'héry, through other sources of the 100 Years' War, describes how at Agincourt, the French horses, quote, so severely handled by the archers that, smarting from pain, they galloped back on the van division and threw it into the utmost confusion, breaking the line in many places. Now, you would say this is the proof that actually the archers inflicted these losses to a point that it's basically the cavalry broadly meant that was stopped and charge halted. This is not really what happened. So Agincourt is actually a very complicated battle to reconstruct for many reasons that we will see, because I think we may be well, I'm not sure, but we could make a video about Agincourt much sooner than we think. In any case, the French had deployed cavalry on the wings, right? There were cavalrymen also in the battle lines in the center, but at large they were men-at-arms. So we are told that the infantry, the cavalry wings were dramatically under strength. They charged the archers that had prompted essentially the French also to abandon their idleness and to actually engage with English that they counted instead to basically exhaust during the day without acting. And it turns out that these longbowmen resist. They had stakes, they had especially actually melee weapons, as we said before, and they managed to fence off this cavalryman. Now, this is very interesting because it's still infantry managing to repel cavalry, but as we understand from the other side, many noblemen not having even presented themselves in the battle, the usual issues of the French army at the era. And so this is far from an optimal or even just an average circumstance, right? And so even in the center, we're told eventually that deprived of the wings, the French tended to cram in the center. And so we observed this issue regarding the so-called Herse formation in the previous video. And even that is not really normal, meaning that having lost the wings and not having others, for example, on the various battle lines is something that raises a bit of curiosity, meaning how were actually these arrays like, and why, and say, if a source says that these Frenchmen crammed themselves into the center and disordered themselves, and some of the horsemen retreated, and threw other units into confusion, like, what are the actual spaces here? What are the actual numbers? What are we really talking about? Because we know that at Agincourt, at the end of the day, the battle was fought and won/lost, depending on what we're talking about, by the actual men-at-arms on foot fighting in the center. And we're properly told that, so the French not only arrived to the English lines, obviously, as we said before, like nobody really stopped, prevented the advance of heavy troops against their counterparts in this open field engagements face-to-face in a de facto symmetrical deployment. But that there was a pretty intense fight in there, and that the battle was effectively won there, at least, even if there were broader tactical quantities involved, including, again, what had happened on the wings with the archers, etc. At the end of the day, the battle was decided in that circumstance. And again, Agincourt is very, very complicated. I suspect it's also probably easier to reconstruct than I think, but compared to other battles is fairly complicated because the sources say, even eyewitnesses to the battles, that say different things and do not really explain what concretely happened. There are sort of lots of mysteries regarding the interpretation of the battle, and this is really notorious for whoever knows the scholarship, right? I will not digress again on the scholarship of how every historian wants to say whatever they think it's more the case or not. This is not important. The important is realizing that there is there is a broader consensus of how the battle went, of course, but when we get into the more sort of precise aspects of big deal of what would this happen in the numbers, the array, the dynamics, the timing, the spaces, everything is much more complicated. Now, the fact that the French would persist in deploying mounted men-at-arms, often in position as wings ahead of the vanguard, and again, we should consider which battles, because it's not even like the English didn't really have a standard tactic just for the sake of it. Not even the French had, especially in this case, because they were, as you understand here, less. They were more changing than the English. The purpose, again, of this deployment on the cavalrymen on the wings surely shows that the purpose was to overrun the enemy archers, which is something that normally does not happen in the art of war, because normally cavalry is sent against cavalry or against the bulk of the infantry forces to shock them. It's not like this happened too often for us to simply say, well, that was the standard French practice to do, but it definitely shows that these longbowmen were dangerous, and at some point the French had if anything, also the abundance of troops, like in theory at Agincourt, if everyone had been deployed, to even spend their own cavalry against the English, which actually could simply mean that what we see as the norm during the 100 Years' War, that the English were being often outnumbered and basically having the less favorable odds, could be taken advantage of by the enemy that had sort of more initiative, whatever. Consider that at Agincourt, the same English, after having defeated the visible amount of the enemy, are paralyzed by fear because they think that there are other forces around. They slaughter even the French prisoners because in that they had captured so many that had they been attacked in that moment, they simply could have not controlled them. So everything is that really chaotic and very often based on the good enough of what you can basically just hope to maintain at a given moment in a pretty emergential and desperate situation like the one in which Henry V found himself. This has nothing to do with the fact that we're talking about one of the greatest commanders of the era, that battle was a masterpiece, that the mere, not just the tactics themselves, but that probably the strategic decision, right, of meeting the French was incredibly brave and but also logical at the same time. So we never talked about Henry V, but quite interesting character to say the least, and hopefully we will do him right with a video or two. The purpose of the French was for themselves to attack the flanks of the English formation. This was, again, what all armies tried to do with each other at the time. And if we find asymmetries between this, it has to do with either what had happened during the engagement of the previous battle lines or how many numbers were there involved. Again, we're not documented in detail how many troops existed on the wings of the individual battle lines, that also we just attentively sometimes are able to reconstruct who was there, etc., mostly based on commanders' names, etc., and with sources saying very different things from one another at times. At Agincourt, about 2,300 mounted men-at-arms were tasked from the French side with the role of essentially outflanking the enemy. Though few, as we've seen, reached their target. This does not mean that they were cut down by the English in between, but that, as other sources say, basically most of these troops did not show up, right? There is one source that says that 800 on the left dwindled to 140 before closing, which does not mean even they were simply cut down, but they may have simply not reached the place, may have diverted, may have retreated, withdrawn for some reason, and this would be the proof that, again, the longbows were effective against the enemy cavalrymen, but it's, again, mostly stopping to Azincourt. At Poitiers, for example, that we have analyzed, there is no evidence whatsoever that that archers were capable of stopping. Well, there wasn't much French cavalry, apparently, but still, having even any effect on the cavalry itself. There was a French intent in that battle to attack the English archers at the beginning of the engagement, which also fared somewhat better, by the way, proving that, again, with crossbowmen, you could basically pull out that task. There is also an instance in which the English began to target the French cavalrymen, but they wouldn't. These were so well armored that they were ineffective, so that they were told by the Earl of Oxford basically to try to get around them and hitting the horses from the flank, because armor deflected the shots. And consider that plate armor is already around. In any case, if you actually read the source, as we did in that video about the Battle of Poitiers, the statement is obvious. They couldn't get the best of even what was basically stationary cavalry at that point, because this happened, if I'm not wrong, if not during an exchange. I think the battle lines were already starting to fight, but this was happening on the wings, but there still were some cavalrymen that were deployed by the French on purpose to shield their own crossbowmen, their own infantrymen, because the cavalry armor was effective against the archers frontally. And so that this frustrates the English that try to get past them, to get around them at least. And so this literally tells you that the French used their cavalry to shield the rest of their troops from the arrows, which means that literally they preferred to take arrows basically without, as the source says here, without basically much wound or damage to begin with. And this is just, again, even less than 60 years before Azincourt. It's not like so much would have practically changed in the technology, in the tactics of this war. So you see how contradictory at times account can be, and or at least they do not actually say that the bow per se was doing the thing. The reason why also at Agincourt what happened on the wings occurred is that it seemed like the infantrymen were not just missile troops, and when the French reached their position, they were able to repel that cavalry, even with means that a simple archer could not have. Right. So at that point, like at Poitiers as well, the cavalry was attacked from the flank, and at that point, hits start arriving. That is also not normal. This happened on the French right and the English left, and there is much debate on the terrain, but it's possible that, again, the English had, again, as defenders in that impervious terrain, like the sort of the cover of the vegetation of the. So the possibility of outflanking the approaching Frenchmen that, as we've seen from the front, could not simply be even punctured. This also is not normal in the sense that outflanking someone that way is not something that normally happens on the battlefields. It's not like you simply have archers on the wings and you say, okay, well, now we will outflank the enemy. What if the enemy outflanks you, right? If you're here in the source, the English literally do that because they're exchanging fire with the French, and they are not able to obtain more than much, right? And as we've seen, even this damage caused to cavalry that apparently eventually stampede their own ranks, inflicting, quote, not a little slaughter among their masters, may be an exaggeration, because this was at the beginning of the engagement. There were other battle lines. The battle proceeded till the last, with the French sending in forces and the English deteriorating till, again, the critical moment in the end. So was this decisive? Evidently not. And why this anecdote? Right? At that point, you should also study the source, where he comes from with that, why he points that out. And it's just like a random anecdote among maybe a battle account that does not even tell about the rest and what happened. with the battle lines that is sort of much more interesting. But that anecdote, you see, stands out, can be quoted, can be cited, because at the end of the day, it speaks of the fact that archers on the wings succeeded against some cavalrymen that we can't even properly focus and say what unit were they and how would they basically simply screen their own crossbowmen, and what kind of role is that, by the way, for heavy cavalry, because there is a hierarchy that doesn't add up there. Evidently, they thought maybe that they could be also outflanked if that, for example, part of their crossbowmen had been taken out by the longbowmen. But here there is also further English outflanking. This is, however, evidently not a normal. The French cavalry charges and the longbowmen stop their charge with hail arrows. That's not like it's, as you see, it's an ever more transverse and secondary aspect of the wall. If you take this out of context because you haven't studied the battle, you may say, well, this is the proof that actually the English arrows could take down the French horses, and so it's easy to explain how these battles were won or lost. That's not how it works. Which, again, if you do, it's like saying, everything was won by the archers. What about the men-at-arms? Were they useless? Well, like the entire glory, pride, and flower of the English nobility was basically nothing in all its culture, in all its tradition, in all its training. It's obviously all in favor of the heavy element of the army, especially if I can't stress this enough, as we have reconstructed that battle to the extent of seeing and confirming that it was all basically about the main battle lines. This is not to say, again, that this tip of the iceberg wasn't important. Maybe they won the battle because of that little action, who knows? But just because this little action was on top of a much bigger action carried out by other people, right? And so that is as relevant, or actually more relevant, than the tip of the iceberg if you decide that it's the only part of the iceberg that has to surface, just because you have to push the narrative that the longbow did that, right? By the way, the French succeeded at some point even against the English, despite all their disasters. We will see this Moron in 1352. That is also pretty close, in fact, to Crécy in the previous time. Christine de Pizan, the famous noble Franco-Italian noblewoman that wrote an extensive amount of information about contemporary warfare, where in 1433, in her Fait d'armes et de chevalerie, still advised that, quote, a troop of men-at-arms should remain mounted to disorganize the enemy's formation, which is actually what we were saying before regarding the coming back of cavalry, even in the later part of the 100 Years' War specifically. Because cavalry had made an important coming back, especially actually in the first part of the war in Europe. But evidently, during the 100 Years' War, something else had been going on. It would be interesting to understand why, especially in the first period, both the English and the French tended to, at least in the first half of the period, because at the beginning there is Crécy, that is evidently not that the French are well mounted, but say in the first part in general, the French also dismounted, and later on they sort of also came back to mounted warfare, just like the English did, depending on the tactical and operational circumstance. During the Azincourt campaign in 1415, the English recognized the threat posed by French cavalry, by the way, and there is this notion that the famous stake that each archer was required at that point to carry would be the implementation of a new defensive tactic that would have naturally also brought specifically to the Agincourt victory through the archers. I personally don't agree with this. I don't think that there is any actual evidence that stakes per se were the game changer, the bigger deal. It's possible, again, that the English were better organized than the French, for example, in bringing this de facto quasi, at least mobile field fortification to bolster their defenses, that's not something you need if you even think that you may have to take on the enemy aggressively to begin with. The English evidently thought that the usual scenario would have repeated itself, but as we explained also in the previous video, there is no need why you wouldn't opt for the offensive, not just as a counter-offensive, but if you have the upper hand. This wasn't evidently the case given the numbers of the English in the Agincourt campaign. So this may have been a temporary provision thought ad hoc for that campaign, but not in the sense that this was an innovation in the medieval art of war. Stakes were used practically, if you realize how they erected their own camps, the various countervallations during sieges, etc. There were some masterpieces of military engineering, enormous infrastructure, etc. Like, what is this carrying a stake with you? Can it be seen as the implementation of a new tactic or whatever? It doesn't make any sense, all right? These stakes have been conceptualized as 6 feet long, so basically tall as much as a person, naturally inclined because in part they had to go underground, were sharpened on both hands, fixed before the archer in the front, and and those who were behind them, other stakes intermediately too, so one end being fixed in the ground towards them and the other sloping towards the enemy, higher than a man's waist from the ground as it was inclined, so it wasn't the full height. And again, this is, I think, like, it's just like the same concept of a palisade, a normal precaution to stop an attack, right? You have some stakes, direction toward them. It's just like a field fortification. And field fortifications increased dramatically during this period all over Europe, right? This is not a specifically English thing. On the contrary, like a stake is also carried like this, is definitely useful to parry some attacks, at least to disarticulate some part of the enemy formation during the same. But again, we're still talking about static defenses manned by the archers. I mean, without the archers and probably also some other heavy infantrymen interspersed, as we've seen at the same Azincourt, these things were obviously useless, like any fortification when it's not manned. So it's not much the physicality of horses will go impaling themselves into that makes you win the battle, right? If that had happened, then every defender would have always used this protection, and they would have won every battle, right? That's not how it works either. It has a cost, by the way, carrying this stuff. Even if it's important, it eventually has a function, but it's just more like an auxiliary one. I will not digress on how and why defensive measures would actually increase on the battlefield at this point. In part, it has to do with the shrinking of the size of armies compared to the previous times. This consequently, the consequent widening, say, of the importance of terrain. The smaller the army, sort of the more attested on particular terrain it can be in a more surgical fashion, so to say. And so you want, especially in these cases of emergential, desperate defense, like the English ones against much bigger armies, that's what you want to do. You want to dig in. Otherwise, just like the French were the attackers, what should they use that, for example? But it's not like they weren't using the stuff reciprocally in other defensive situations, like in sieges or whatever. Again, if you look at how they used field fortifications all over Europe, these stakes seem like the basic vanilla version of anything to begin with. And we made multiple videos. For example, we have looked at Italian battlefields, more or less of the same era. Molinella, Caravaggio, those were heavily fortified battlefields, even though there were proper battles fought across them, right? But in that sense, where's the limit between the innovation and the necessity? And, what is using stakes, this radically innovative thing, compared to, how warfare would have normally fared at the time. I mean, it seems a bit excessive to overly emphasize. And again, always getting down to the technology, always getting down to the material, inanimated object. What about the men that fought among the stakes, right? And what about those that also wouldn't fight with those stakes in front of them, because at this point the notion is that if just the archers carry this, mostly you're inviting the French to attack in the center, so hoping that they would divert their attention from the wings, which, by the way, at Agincourt they do not do, even though they will fail at taking them over, as we just pointed out. But did they fail to take them over because of the stakes, or did they fail because, again, as we're told, they were radically under strength? And of all those men that should have carried out that attack, most of them did not even show up for some reason that evidently has not to do with what eventually happened in combat, right? There are 3 horses during the Battle of Agincourt explicitly documented in the sources as falling impaled on the stakes. So probably several of the few cavalry that had managed to carry out the charge across the field, and also across the arrow storm, as we've seen, did die on these stakes. The horses, by the way. I wouldn't even simply limit how many horses may have died this way, or even accidentally how many knights, but that's another story. Being well armored made it difficult to be impaled in that sense, but physics does strange things at the time. There's this notion that horses do not really smash into objects, but this is really not the case. Chargers, like hyper-loaded stallions, etc., some of them, it's not even just about the horse per se, the type of the horse, but about the single horse, right? We know some horses smash their limbs, they break their bones against fences, they are more aggressive, they run into things, because yes, they're very intelligent, but just like people, they can be also very dumb in some ways, and if they're hyper loaded, aggressive, they want to charge, etc., they don't necessarily rationalize that they're going to harm themselves by smashing into targets like these, that, by the way, are a bit unusual, right? And generally speaking, cavalry did always charge into some solid defenses. We should get rid of this notion that, cavalries avoid themselves when they charge, or they do not charge into the enemy pikes. They always did that. We know at the Battle of Austerlitz, we made a video about that, the French and the Russian cuirassiers smashing into one another could be heard at miles of distance. We discussed this also in the previous video when talking about how the English would charge into the Scottish Skiltron, and how normally up to the early 14th century, for a couple of centuries, infantry had always given way to cavalry charges that were to be repeated against them. We know that pretty well. I mean, the battles of the Lombard League, we know at battles like Legnano or Cortenuova, that the Lombards, the Lombard footmen resisted an entire days against the charges of the imperial cavalry, that were the heaviest, the most effective, at the peak of their strength, especially in the 13th century. You smash into that. It doesn't even matter what kind of weapon you use. The only weapon you ever use to stop the enemy charges is the pike. And this is true since there is cavalry everywhere, right? So unless you're fighting against other cavalrymen, and in that sense you will have some sort of pikes in your hands as well. But the only difference being how cohesive the infantry is, and if it is not enough to sustain a cavalry charge, cavalrymen will break through the pikemen, they will smash into the pikemen's lines, and yes, some will fall, but most of them will pour through and make a massacre of the enemy. This is how normally tactics worked, right? The notion that it was all a fake, and they pulled out before impacting, and that would be no actual crashing. It's just a post-Vietnam War, decerebrated mental illness. It has nothing to do with actual warfare and actual history. So some scholars fantasize a bit too much on the stakes' relevance, also as far as other countries would eventually adopt them. For example, from the English example, it's true again that English archers were hired at a point, for example, in the Burgundian armies of the era, not just the ones of the 100 Years' War when the Anglo-Burgundian alliance was a thing, but later at the time of Charles the Bold, we talked about this. There were longbowmen from other countries. This has been explained throughout all the time. There are anecdotes about Italian archers in the English, among the English longbowmen during battles like Crécy, for example. It's said that the famous Duke of Athens died killed by a Florentine arrow at the Battle of Crécy. It's an anecdote more than else, but there was a lot of internationality actually of this stuff. The French and the Burgundians did adopt stakes, at least on a more regular basis, for some reason that may have to do with that broader process of field fortification and or surely also imitation of the English. There is no problem in that. But again, the main reason, this is again the tip of the iceberg, why did those stakes started to appear consistently? Also in a time in which cavalry was regaining steam, or maybe exactly because of that you would say, but then why not before, right? In my opinion, again, it's a very contingental reason, and it's likely that stakes were really there in all medieval armies and that were used in different ways in different circumstances, especially during sieges, because most of these armies would stop besieging something, so why not having stakes to begin with for palisades and whatever. So Philippe de Comines notes that the Burgundians used stakes at Montl'héry in 1465. So again, some scholars go on and say, that these existed since the 1430s, the 1420s, so you can connect it to Azincourt, because we know that in that battle the stakes were there. Really, what's the actual link here? Like, it's more like, even if it weren't a coincidence, it may not have specifically to do with, again, we discovered stakes. What a great invention in the history of warfare, at the times in which artillery parks were around, in which massive fortifications were present, like a stake, surely. Something you could have since prehistory. It's really the game changer, right? Everybody's stupid. It really takes somebody who discovered cold water to change the game, really. It is not to say that warfare does not go by trial and mistakes, etc. But again, to presume that somebody has to be taught these things, just also from the 20th, 21st century perspective, that still, as I hopefully demonstrate, like, still has big issues in actually understanding the same nature of warfare, and history itself is a bit too much. The French, for example, were also more aggressively biased, or at least they had historically more sympathy for cavalry warfare that is inherently only offensive. Unless you dismount, cavalry that becomes infantry in that instance cannot defend by definition. The French used stakes sporadically by 1449. We have evidence of that. But again, to presume that they wouldn't do, or that they didn't do it, I don't know, in the 13th and the 12th century, it's just, in my opinion, insanity. So regarding the melee capacity of longbowmen as well, of course, there was a moment, as we've seen very well at Agincourt, especially when the same longbowmen were called to defend their positions in close combat. The Sire de Saint-Remy, an English combatant at Agincourt, recounts how the archers, quote, quitted their stakes, threw down their bows and arrows, and seizing their swords, axes, and other weapons, sallied out upon them and killed and disabled the French. Right. This, again, I am not sure it's really connected with the actual charge of the cavalry against the stakes themselves. I think this has to do with a normal flank attack of how we described it in the previous video. You have normally wings that wait for the enemy to come to grips with your main battle line, and if there is no wing to defeat in the front, you close on them. So absolutely, these troops were equipped with secondary weapons. At this point in history, given the professionalization and also the relative affluence of the era, you have these soldiers being capable of wielding pretty sort of heavy stuff, like at least swords, axes, pole axes, something like that. It would have been pretty typical. If we imagine this happening when the French sort of bogged themselves down close to the stakes or whatever for some reason, which again doesn't make much sense because they did arrive into the stakes and began to fight those guys and were pushed back. It may be the same episode, in fact, but in something a bit more closely thought than we realize. Baker, describing the Battle of Poitiers, vividly captures the final moments of a French advance. Quote, "Flying spears cascaded from polished shields, their points finding their mark like thunderbolts." Spears, by the way, because we don't have to imagine there being just, again, archers, including crossbowmen, but even javeliners, people who threw slings, shots, and more. I made a video about the bidot. We've seen how actually common and frequent, especially in Gascon armies, they were. So there's really nothing strange about this. Then the citation goes on and says, "Then the threatening mob of crossbowmen darkened the sky with a dense mist of bolts, and the archers replied with a hail of arrows from the English side, who were now in a state of desperate fury." So this actually captures the struggle between the longbowmen and the crossbowmen in a relatively balanced fashion. Ashwood javelins flew through the air to greet the enemy at a distance, and the dense troops of the French army, protecting their bodies with joined shields, turned their faces away from the missiles. All right, so the archers emptied their quivers in vain, but armed swords and shields, they attacked the heavily armed enemy. So here we have, again, as we observed in the video about the Battle of Poitiers, an explicit reference to the fact that at some point, this as it normally happens, the missile fire per se may be actually useless, right? The fact that, in fact, the light element at the end of the day, at the end of the story, is not decisive, and it's there exactly mostly to perform an auxiliary role rather than else, right? Because today we at least provided with multiple examples of different stuff, as you understand, and that can obviously shed light a bit better on how effective the longbows and the longbowmen could be, right? And it's a different thing because, again, it's the performance of the bow, but also, as we've seen, secondary weapons the longbowmen could have, etc. But always remember that throughout this whole period, and including the battles of the 100 Years' War, there is actually no evidence. And Agincourt being maybe the exception that confirms the rule here, that and one exception that is pretty murky considering the tactical circumstances, and that definitely do not talk about the end of cavalry charges because of English arrows per se. As the French cavalry arrived to the enemy lines evidently intact to carry out a further attack, no matter whether they were eventually repulsed by this, that the missile weapon is subsidiary, that they perform an auxiliary role, that the actual, as we will see in the later episode, in the last episode of this mini-series, the greatest work is actually carried out by the men-at-arms, that really pass, for many reasons that are probably very, very distant from the warfare, the military logic of the time, from the actual reality of combat, right? And that pertain very much to the modernistic mythology, the progressistic, technologistic, deterministic mythology that has been made of this chapter of English warfare for many reasons, right? You can't really understand why this may have happened during the 19th century, during the 20th century. It's not the fact that rightfully the English wanted to portray in glorious terms this phase of their military history. They could have done it really, and it's their prerogative, as they fully deserve to celebrate this. But the question is, how was it done, right? In a time of positivism, of technologism, I mean, I could make different names, right? For example, now the sport of the situation is thinking that Churchill was worse than Hitler for some reason. I have a great respect for Churchill. I really would like to make multiple videos on him also to debunk all that nonsense. But Churchill himself, that was the guy, by the way, that there you have to understand historical context. This is the guy who brought the Royal Navy on land, right? He's the guy who invented tanks single-handedly and brought them doctrinally on the battlefields of Europe. Of course, a man who had that technological insight, or at least doctrinal insight regarding the importance of technology, at that point in a country with a very old, the oldest European industrialization, etc., would obviously describe, as he did in his military historical works, of course, the English longbow as the paramount thing, in part because, by the way, he was not just making it up. There was all centuries-old tradition in England that, especially in that gentry sense, that in a way was initially allied with the monarchy, especially at this point in the Middle Ages, then later on sort of emerged against the monarchy to mitigate it. And so all the mythology of the broader achievement of reducing the monarchy to a very poor thing would have passed through this final rank longbowman, right? That with his bow did everything because he was the cool guy, and denying actually the role of the guys who really did the thing, that were the noblemen at large, is a bit nonsensical. Keyword: combined arms tactics, right? The men-at-arms would have not won without longbowmen, but this is not to say that longbowmen were more important than the men-at-arms. This is not true. Let's simply learn the basics, the differences between absolute and relative. If you don't understand that, if you don't focus on that, what can you focus on in life? Seriously, right? So again, chapeau to the English longbowmen, for whom I have a great respect overall, considering the general situation in which they were operating, and the incredible feats they managed to pull off in that context. But let's also be extremely real about what is the actual range, not much of their arrows shot, but properly of their tactical accomplishment and tactical achievement. Because, by the way, I have also an entire playlist dedicated to medieval archery, which in this sense is pretty. I'm just checking it now. It's not really that hefty, but we made, I don't know, 12 videos already. This goes straight to as the 13th. Probably made more, but I can't remember, because because there is actually medieval, this is archery, but there is medieval missile too, which includes, in fact, 23. Yep. We talk about slingers, we talk about missile, includes, of course, also firearms for medieval times. So in general, like, we covered an important amount of this stuff in ways that we really wanted. For today, however, I stop it here. Again, stay tuned for the English men-at-arms of the 100 Years' War if you're interested in that. And again, that's not going to be the historical military unit video type. I, by the way, created already something about the era that, if you're interested in that kind of prototype of war here. For the arms and armor series, I made the a video about the armor of Sir George Felbridge from the effigy at the parish church of Playford, County Suffolk, dating roughly to 1400, right around there. So it fits Agincourt, or slightly earlier. We will make many videos just about all these different types of guys, so we will come to know them pretty well in their arms and armor, in their battlefield role, etc. The next video about the English men-at-arms of 100 Years' War is, as you see also from the title, has its frame here, it's tactical in nature, like focus and narrowing it down to the tactical role of the men-at-arms as opposed to the one of the longbowmen. And after that, of course, we will be talking about lots of stuff about English warfare that I feel like I wish I had really made more about, because I would like to have many more viewers from the UK and any other sort of, let's say, Commonwealth, dependencies of the British Empire, let's put it in this way. I love to live in the past. That's how I see the world, hopelessly. So you have to cope with that. But medieval England, 58 videos. This is the 59th. It's not enough. It's simply not enough, right? So we will get somewhere with this. More we have to talk, especially about late medieval England, that I haven't made much to begin with, right? And that's not good. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.